Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage.
Today we're talking about God's redemptive power in recovering from infidelity and how couples can come out of this situation stronger than ever before. We have two very special guests with us today, Brenna and Garrett Naufel. Both have been through a very difficult betrayal, and they will be sharing their experiences on how they got through it and what advice they have for couples in the same situation. We hope this episode will provide biblical insight and hope-filled guidance on how to handle infidelity, as well as provide comfort to those who are struggling. Let's begin by having our guests tell us a bit more about themselves and how they got through this very difficult period in their lives.
We want to welcome you to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. We're Doug and Leslie Davis, and we've got a couple of guests with us today that we know are going to be able to bring some encouragement to your heart.
Today we're sitting with Brenna and Garrett Naufel, and they have an amazing story of redemption to tell us. And so let's just jump right in. Brenna and Garrett, can you tell us about your story?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So we were married back in 1998. That feels weird to say, but it has been that long at this point. And young, early 20s at that point. Brenna finishing college, me fresh out of college, and was a relatively young believer, new believer at the time. Brenna had been following the Lord for a little bit. We met at a Christian leadership conference that was held by a missions organization every summer in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And so we spent a summer living on the beach and sharing the gospel and working in grocery stores and getting to know each other. And at the end of that summer, the Lord seemed to be leading us toward marriage. And so we were married the following spring in 1998, like I said. And so lived in Austin, Texas at that time, worked bivocationally, served in the church for 4 years there. And then in 2001, went on staff with a missions organization at the time that was called Great Commission Ministries, now known as Reliant Mission. And subsequently moved to Missouri, Columbia, Missouri, to serve in a church in Columbia there that was particularly reaching out to the University of Missouri. And we're support-based missionaries. And so, that requires some work to get you into the field. And so spent close to 2 years, about 1.75 years, essentially 2 years, raising support there in Columbia. And it was in that time that as we were young marrieds in this new city, away from all the community we'd known previously together as a married couple, really kind of isolated even from our local church community other than Sundays due to the process of support raising, that we began to encounter those probably unknown to us at the time, or we were unaware, just challenges in our marriage where we were really drifting, I would say, apart, not intentionally, but it was also in that time frame that I won't even say fell into, because that wouldn't be appropriate to truthfully say. I began an 8-year struggle on and off again with online pornography during that time as well. And so, yeah, we were young, married, living in this isolation. I began this struggle and this ongoing on and off again situation with online pornography. Finished support raising, like I said, at about 2 years, and went on staff with our church there in Columbia, and we're serving there all the while, Brenna not knowing that I had this struggle, and me, doing, unfortunately, the kind of what is all too common story of like sharing with certain people and really not getting, not really being vulnerable to a degree that would allow them to then speak into my life and say, hey, your wife should know this has to stop. You cannot serve two gods, but more getting really enabling counsel that said, just figure it out. It's just going to be worse for Brenna to know these things. Yeah. And I think even at the time, knowing that wasn't good counsel, but having such a great degree of fear what that might mean, and knowing the damage that I was continuously doing on some level. I understood that, probably not fully until it was in the light.
So what I hear
Yeah,
you saying was that there was like this perfect storm of things that kind of came together that left your relationship vulnerable to outside connection, to an affair. And so, and without godly support coming alongside of you and kind of holding accountable, and not even like, I don't even like the term, we don't like to be held accountable, right? That's 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 kind of a taboo term, but that, like, that support system that can speak godly counsel into your life, that wasn't even there due to the kind of isolation that you had in your relationship. So what transpired from that?
Yeah. So I didn't know what was going on with Garrett. So it was about 3 years into our marriage that he started the struggle. And for a couple of years, I had begun to feel an emotional distance from him that I didn't know what it was. I couldn't explain it. I just felt it. And at the same time, when we did move to Missouri and we're kind of isolated, I gradually stopped spending time with the Lord. I just naively was coasting on my previous experience with God, which was wonderful and beautiful and real, and intimate. But I wasn't putting on my daily armor and taking, getting my daily bread. And so that also just, left myself and my thoughts and super vulnerable. And eventually I began to fantasize. I wasn't capturing, taking my thoughts captive. And I began to fantasize about being pursued, not even anything physically that I was fantasizing about. Anything would stop short of that when I was, picturing these things or desiring these things, but just truly about being pursued. But again, I wasn't putting those things to death. I allowed my mind to linger there longer and longer. Unbeknownst to Garrett, I wasn't sharing this with him either, so we're both starting to hide things from one another. And that eventually led into real life flirtations. And again, in my heart and in my mind, I would never pass a certain line, I would never go this far. And so in a sense, you almost feel like, well, it's okay if I go up to this point, because surely I would never go past it. There's no harm, no foul type of thinking, the lies that you start to believe. And my dad had an affair when I was younger. And so it was definitely a very real part of my life where I saw the damage and the destruction that came along with his affair. And that was something I would never do. And I thought I was above that and beyond that. And how could so-and-so ever do that to their spouse? But sure enough, as I continued to get closer and closer to this imaginary line, it started to move further and further out, and still wasn't talking with anyone. I wasn't confessing these thoughts or these patterns. And I found myself alone with a man at a business event, and he took the opportunity to kiss me. And again, that's something I thought that I would never allow, but I didn't turn away. I didn't turn back. I didn't flee. And that eventually led into what became a 5-year long affair. And so this is coinciding with the last 5 years of Garrett's struggle with pornography and my 5 years with this affair, that neither one of us had no idea what was going on in each other's lives. But it was certainly evident that we weren't as close. Obviously it's causing damage in our relationship, but we aren't addressing it. We're just living our separate lives, essentially. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think in that process, I was aware that something was not right, but my thinking at the time was, she's just struggling. She's struggling to feel intimacy with the Lord, and my job as her husband is to weather the storm, wait patiently, encourage, not to press too much, or and just to receive her where she's at and walk with her as much as I understood to do that, and as much as I was able to do that when I'm withholding part of my life that was meant for her alone and giving it to this fabricated fantasy world of just just filth, and so yeah, I think, as Brenna's saying, there was an awareness on both our parts that something was not right, but not nearly to the degree of what was actually really happening in our
Sure.
marriage and in our lives. Yeah.
Yeah, he had never struggled with pornography before our marriage, and
No.
so I just thought, simplistically thought it would never become an issue in our marriage because now we're married. Like why would it become an issue now was, my young, naive thinking, unfortunately. And then he, of course, never in his wildest imagination would have thought what I was doing was what I was actually doing. So,
Well, and even the pornography piece, like I had not struggled, and I did not go looking for it. Like I genuinely accidentally stumbled into it. Like we literally was searching something on the internet and something completely unrelated popped up. But to Brenna's point, I did not flee. I did not take the commands of scripture to flee from sexual immorality. I instead went straight in, and then I was hooked, and for me, my history had been that prior to being a believer, sex and sexuality were equated with love for me. And so where I felt that there was a lack in our marriage, there was a perfect, because I wasn't stepping toward that with Brenna and saying, hey, something's not right between us in this realm. And it's not just you, it's probably me as well, or maybe it's not you at all. It is just me. I don't know at the time, because I falsely believed there was some kind of like satisfaction there. It was, previously, prior to being a believer, that was a coping mechanism, like sex and inappropriate relationships with women and things like that. That was a salve to an ache in my heart. And so it was really easy to, unfortunately, to foolishly fall back into coping mechanisms to try to deal with what was really going on in my heart, which had far more to do with brokenness and lack of intimacy with the Lord and with my wife and all those things that were present than it did with just sex itself, if that makes sense. I was definitely looking for something more than a sexual experience there. I was looking for wholeness. I was looking for belonging. I was looking for the things that only Jesus can give, and I was not finding them.
Yeah, and I think that's so important too, to bring that out, that the searching, the longing in your heart wasn't for the physical part of it, that it was just so much, there was so much more there. Right. Yeah. So, okay.
And I think a lot of our listeners can relate to what the two of you shared so far, whether they have struggled with pornography or not, whether they've had an affair or not. But the whole concept of looking for something that will fill that void when there's a lack of intimacy, and and calling it what it is, fantasizing about this will make me feel better. This will be a balm that will, help me where I'm hurting. I think that's something that a lot of people deal with, whether they find themselves in a struggle that's similar to yours or not. And so what was it that caused your struggles to come out into the open?
Yeah. So in 2009, so like I said, 8 years into my on and off again affair with pornography, I was sitting in a restaurant waiting to meet a guy right across the campus from the University of Missouri, and I was reading my Bible, and I just sensed very clearly in my spirit just the word of the Lord coming to me and saying, this is enough. This can no longer be. You cannot say that you're following me. You cannot say you're going to serve my church and my people, let alone try to lead and want to be a pastor, even though I'm at this point in a pastoral role, yet not ordained yet. And continue in this. You are not in keeping with my way. You're not experiencing life. This has just been death. And so it was both the to use the cliche, it was a very much a come to Jesus moment. It was very much like, who are you going to serve? And today is the day. Life and death is before you. What are you going to choose? I think all the way back to Deuteronomy, when the Lord puts that before his people, right? And it's not the only time by any means, but for me, that was that day. And so I just broke down sitting there waiting to meet this guy that I was, reaching out to and started bawling. And I knew it was like, okay, as soon as I get home, this has to all be out there. This has to be confessed. This cannot be any longer. And by God's grace, that's what happened. I went home from campus. I just confessed, said, Brenna, this is what's been going on. This is for how long. We can talk about the details as much as you want to. I will answer anything. I recognize I need to flee from this. I need to fully repent. Here's access to all my devices, all the things to just be in the light, right? To just live in a way where, because I remember as I'm talking with Jesus and I'm praying in that restaurant, I'm sure people around me thought I was crazy because I'm just sitting there crying and seemingly talking to myself. And I remember just as I'm interacting with Jesus there, just remember very clearly hearing, if I step in the light, what I'm doing is I'm saying, you are trustworthy, Jesus, that you will do that which you say you will do. You will redeem. And I have no idea how this is going to happen. I have no idea if my wife is going to hate me forever, divorce me. Like, I don't know. I really don't know. But I believe, Lord, that being in the light with this and being with you in this will ultimately bring healing, restoration, the things that I really am longing for, the contentment and satisfaction of my heart, and what's best for my wife and my family. You will do that. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I trust that if I quote unquote risk this, that it's really not much of a risk, that you are trustworthy of this.
And so in today's culture, that's particularly difficult to be that vulnerable. We're supposed to be, and we're supposed to humble ourselves. But, we live in a culture of shame right now. We don't call it a shame culture. We call it a cancel culture. But, we live in a culture right now where if you do something that the bulk of society says isn't okay, they're going to completely shun you. And so the fear of having somebody like your spouse reject you during that time is very real. I know a lot of our listeners right now are thinking, I can relate to what's been shared. I'm struggling with pornography, and I know that I need to stop this, but they're so afraid because of the shame. They're so afraid to tell their spouse. And so, that's a step that I loved what you shared, that God showed you that he was trustworthy, because that's the only thing, the shame that we feel is something that's real that has to be overcome. But the grace that God gives is real as well, and it will overcome it. That was great. So what was going on with you at the time, Brenna?
Yeah. So Garret shared this. Meanwhile, as I've shared, I'm still hiding my own incredible sinful life. And so when he shared it, there was a couple of things that I felt. I felt relief and gratefulness in a way, because I felt like that explained some of this emotional distance that I had felt for so long, even before I started engaging in an affair. Having been entangled in sin for so long, I was happy for him to step into the light and hopefully break free from that, because I knew how much death that had caused in my own life of being entangled in my own sin and not wanting to do the things that I was doing. And so there was those feelings. And at the same time, I didn't feel like I had the right or even the ability to really grieve or feel the hurt from what he had confessed, because I was hiding my own stuff. Like, how can I feel those things when I've been doing what I have been doing? And so I feel like we moved past it fairly quickly. I'm pretty sure I extended forgiveness that night. And I did. I felt like I truly did forgive you. At the same time, I didn't take the time to really process it and grieve it and ask questions and really think about the impact of what had been done at that time. And so you would think at this time would be the perfect opportunity for me to confess my stuff. And it was, but I didn't do it. I was also
so this was February of 2009 when I confessed to her.
Yes. And so I am still deathly afraid. I felt like that past December, so a couple of months before I felt like I was done. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. I was living more straight and narrow. Like, I was doing things in my own strength, but I still hadn't really truly confessed. So there's probably part of that too. Like, well, okay, I've gotten past my thing, but yet I was continually being sucked back into this affair and this relationship as well. And so I didn't confess at the time. And so about 3 months after Garret confessed to me, I actually was confronted by a previous coworker of mine that had heard rumors about me having an affair because it was with another man that I worked with. And he confronted me. He had his own stuff going on in his life. There's lots of things that kind of made me question why he was confronting me the way he was. But God was certainly using that to say, okay, now it's your turn. Now is the time. No more hiding. No more, none of this either. And so I'm grateful for that, because there was always something else where I could do it on my own. I just was afraid, because certainly, same thing. Like, how would Garrett respond? Would he hate me forever? Would we get divorced? Like, you're afraid of all of the consequences, that are very real to your sin that you haven't had to deal with yet until now. And so he confronted me. He said, either you tell your husband or I do. And I said, I will tell him. But I was kind of the breadwinner. This was my job. This was our insurance. Our other co-pastors were going out of town in a couple of weeks. I was supposed to leave to Italy with my mom the next week. Like, there was all the reasons to not tell him yet. And but by God's grace, again, even though it's certainly not the way I would have wanted him to find out, this man didn't allow any more time. And he called Garrett probably about 5 days or so after he had confronted me, and called Garrett and said, basically, do you know this is what your wife is doing? And so that is how my sin came into the light. And so he called me at work after getting that phone call and said, you need to come home. We need to talk. I certainly suspected what I knew, what I thought that was going to be about. And I walked in our living room, and he sat me down on the couch. He said, I have to ask you something. And he almost seemed like even asking this question felt like ridiculous. Like, why would I have to ask you this question? Like,
there was no possibility in my mind that
it was true.
It was true.
Yeah. And so that was kind of how he asked it. And that broke my heart too. And, but he asked it, is this true? And I said, yes, it is. And so from there, everything's in the light. We called one of our other pastors over just to be a support. And they asked a lot more questions, and I answered them all truthfully. I was committed to answering them truthfully. And I felt, even though there was still so much guilt and shame and sorrow and just brokenness over all of the hurt that I had caused and all of the things that I had done, I also in that same moment felt incredible peace and freedom and joy, because I was finally breaking free from the sin that had entangled me for so long and was causing so much death. Like, I could feel at times the Holy Spirit grieve within me. Like, that's just, you can't even explain what that feels like unless you've been there. And so it was all of those feelings at once. And we're just so grateful that we got to walk that journey. But then it was quite a long road after that. There's a lot that came after that, but that's how we got there as far as getting things into the light. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I heard you mention is that there were lies that were believed, that, through, up to this point, that you guys were believing lies about your relationship, about each other, about yourselves. Like, what were those lies, and how did that play out in leaving your relationship vulnerable to an affair?
Yeah, absolutely.
I should just say affairs, because technically both of you were having an affair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how tell us about those lies that you believed and how that undermined your relationship.
Sure. Yeah. There's kind of two levels of this, right? So some of it I wasn't aware of all of these being lies at the time. Like, that's kind of, what the deceiver does. Like, you just think these things, and you take them as truth almost. And so that's why they're a lie. But I had begun to believe that this is just who I am. That was Satan's biggest lie to me. This is just who you are. There is no way God will ever take you back. You have sinned far too great for far too long. He will not forgive you. There is no hope, so that's kind of the lies surrounding the affair. And me even just starting to believe, like, this is just who I am, and by God's grace, in the aftermath of this, really was like, no, I get to say who you are. And then going back, kind of in our healing journey, I was able to go back even to like childhood wounds and just core beliefs that had developed that you're, again, not really aware of, but because of your experiences or because of, just the things you've gone through, you start to believe these things in your heart, but you're not conscientious about them. And so for me, I think coming out of my parents' divorce and some of my experiences, my deeper core beliefs were I was not wanted. I am not worth fighting for. I am either too much or I'm not enough. Some of those kind of beliefs that we were able to really identify. And I'm a burden. That's probably my biggest one, is that I'm just a burden.
So all
And
of those lies would make it very, very scary to come
yes,
home and say, this is what's been going on, because
yeah,
when you're believing that, then you're expecting Garrett's reaction to be in line with those beliefs.
sure. Yeah.
And
He's not going to fight for me. I'm not worth it. Like there is no forgiveness, all those things. Sure.
yeah, but that's not what God had planned.
No,
No.
no, not at all. And so I don't know if there was some other beliefs, lies
Yeah.
that you had.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. There's been a consistent theme in my life of always feeling alone and always feeling unwanted. And I've literally been told, like verbally been told, you are not wanted. Go away. I don't want you. I mean, multiple occasions in my life. This is
So
not an
sorry.
isolated incident. Thank you. Yeah. And so, that's part of the beautiful thing. And Jesus is like, he sees me completely for who I am, and he wants me more than anybody.
Yeah.
But knowing that here and having that translate into intimacy and relationship and maturity in Jesus has been the journey, right? And so I think coming into our marriage, I still have those questions like, is my own wife going to ultimately want me when she really has been with me for a while, really sees me for who I am? But as I mentioned earlier, very early in my life, I had equated sexual intimacy and then just even sexual pleasure with notions of love, because the thinking as a child, and this is childish thinking, right? It's immature thinking in a way, is that if someone is willing to have sexual relationship with me, that means I am wanted. And so it's just it feeds itself, right? It's a cycle that says, well, as much as I can engage in this, the more it reinforces this feeling, this belief in my mind. Now, I recognize there's no intimacy in pornography whatsoever, but there is a false sense that comes with that pleasure in the pleasure centers of the brain, right? Of some aspect of that. And so it tapped into that for me. And so in our marriage and in that process, I had come to a place, and I don't think I wasn't necessarily conscious of it at the time, of just believing, okay, I'm finding that we are engaging in sexual intimacy less and less. And this is even prior to either one of us engaging in the things we were engaging in. And I'm reading that subconsciously as, okay, I'm starting to be unwanted. I'm starting to be rejected. I am alone. I will always be alone. I struggle with that problem today. Like I have to renew my mind all the time of, no, this is what Jesus has truly done. He's shown this. There's no doubting this. He continues to show it. And yet in my foolishness and my fallenness, I can go to those places of, no, Jesus took you because he has to take you, because he's love, and not necessarily because there's great affection behind it, but he's redeeming those who would place their faith in him. We could get into all the theology behind that, right? But but the reality being, know that I am not, for lack of better terminology, the unwanted child of heaven that had to be received, but that I was pursued and continue to be pursued, and that the Lord takes great joy in doing that. I would have been able to articulate, I'm sharing the gospel on campus, I'm teaching people this all the time, but did I have a full sense of that in my heart? Was I experiencing that? No, and that's on me. That's on me, because I was not renewing my mind in those ways. I was not saying, Jesus, how do I step deeper into this when I'm feeling this, rather than pull away? Right? Because my tendency is to do things of my own strength. My tendency is, I will not quit. I will not give up. And therefore, you just gut out life. You just survive it. So at the end, you made it. And so if my goal was at the end to say I'm still a Christian, well, I'm going to have to do that, rather than trusting that God has already secured my place. He has done it. I can rest in that, take peace in that, and experience that without striving, instead responding in worship, rather than trying to, as if I was a Galatian and just trying to pursue my own righteousness.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that there were kind of two major things that left your relationship vulnerable. Was one, not being in the word and renewing your mind and trusting Jesus. And 2, not communicating with each other about your struggles, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So in the redemption process, like as the Lord was redeeming your marriage and bringing you two back together, how did that change your communication process?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, for
Yeah, it wasn't on the list. I'm sorry.
No, it's
Put you on
great.
the spot.
That's great. That's
no,
great.
no worries.
No.
We like it to be organic too,
Yes.
so that's great. For quite some time, and this I think laid the foundation for where we're at even today. We're just like in kind of crisis mode of recovering from all of the things that had just been revealed. And Garret in particular, he wanted to know all the details of my affair. And I know that's not everyone, and there could be some boundaries around that for some couples too. But I had committed to him, if you ask me a question, I will answer it honestly. And if you just don't think of all the right questions to ask, but I think of something or I remember something, I commit to going to you and telling you. And I think that was so important for us, at least, in that I don't know if I would have felt truly fully forgiven and just known and seen and loved by Garret if there were some things that still felt hidden in a sense. And so I appreciate that process, but it was excruciatingly painful and so difficult. But going back to your question, that we were able to then communicate with one another then and still now in a much more honest and transparent way, knowing that we have a common enemy that seeks to want to destroy our marriage and what God has brought together, that we are not one another's enemy. So if I am struggling with something, or if I have a thought, that we can go and share that with one another, because we're not trying to fight against one another or hurt one another. We're trying to like kick Satan in the face and get him out of there. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so that's kind of been more the perspective that we have in our communication now.
Yeah.
Something to add.
Yeah. I think, I think part of it is too, is just the humility to recognize, at least for me, a lot of the ways that I feel about things and experience things are really about me. Meaning the problem is usually not external, it's usually internal. Like the biggest problem in our marriage is not Brenna, it's me. It's my fallenness, it's the stuff that I bring to the table. And so, looking back, when I was sensing this lack of intimacy, what I wish I had done, what I wish I could go back and do is just go, hey, I'm feeling this, and maybe it's not real, maybe it is, maybe you aren't, but I'm really struggling with this, and I'm tempted to go back to old ways of coping with stress and feeling lonely and all those things, and just being in the light with all my stuff, and not just I think there, unfortunately, amongst God's people, there can be a tendency to say, here are the acceptable sins to talk about. And then here are the ones that we don't really want to go there, because if we go there, like, it never turns out good, and I got counsel along that line, right? Like, she doesn't need to know this. It's just going to make things worse, and again, my ears probably wanted to hear that, because it meant I didn't have to, on some level, I didn't have to, even though we were having to deal with the repercussions of my sin, I didn't have to deal with that piece,
At the time.
So at the time. And so I think part of our communication was, just a commitment to say, you ask, I will answer. And you don't even have to ask. If there's something I'm like, I know we've been talking about stuff, and this clearly would be information that you might want to know. Hey, do you want to know this? I'm happy to talk to you about this. Here's what's going on with me. And the other thing I think that was big too is, in our process, especially early on, so we went and got marriage counseling, Christian marriage counseling. That was huge from the get-go. We got connected with a woman who has since become a lifelong friend. We love her to death.
We did it individually and as a couple.
We did both, and we just committed to, we need help. We're going to get every tool out of the toolbox to get that help. Like, I have a psychology background and a desire in counseling anyway, and so for I think for both of us, it was like, there's just no shame in going. There was no stigma attached to counseling
Good.
for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
I recognize that for some there is, and
Which is-
my encouragement is, I can hear that, I can understand that, but at the end of the day, I think what's more important is you get the help that you need, and so we were committed from the very beginning. Let's just surround ourselves with as many godly, wise people to help us to move toward Jesus and with Jesus in this, and not to do what we've been doing, which is to do it in isolation and do it alone.
Well, and even in that communication, having that help and that guidance, because we were just advised to not only have one another, but who else can you talk to as well? That we weren't just one another's only kind of, outlet, if you will.
Yes.
And just small things, like my heart would so easily shut down if Garrett, as he was processing and trying to make things real, would say things like, you did this and you did this, not like in a accusatory way, but more in I'm trying to understand that this is my reality and this is what actually happened. But I would shut down so fast, versus if he came to me and said, I feel so fill in the blank because of this, then my heart would just open up so much more with just compassion and an ability. Like I was willing, but it was just hard the other way, but with an ability to receive him, where he was at with that. And so just even, having some of those tools of how to communicate as we're trying to walk through things that are so hard.
Yeah.
And being tempted to, man, we're having a good day today, but I remembered something, like, oh my gosh, do I have to bring it up? It's a good day. I don't want to rock the boat. And so there were times where I might have waited a day or two where I just was not excited about having to hit it. Like he explained one time, it was like being hit over and over again with a baseball bat. He's like, at first you feel the first few blows, but after a while it's just all pain. And so I just felt like every single time when we were doing, maybe had a good day, or it wasn't as tense or as just overwhelming, but then I might remember something like, yeah, it was so hard to want to go and tell him, but we were committed to do that. And I think that was so important in our restoration process.
I think some of the good counsel there too was like, make appointments, if you will, with one another to, like, if you're in the middle of something and it's just kind of unraveling, to be able to go, hey, you need to stop, I need to stop, whoever, can we stop now and commit to picking this back up tomorrow or in a couple of days? So we're not just constantly drowning in disaster, because there was and is more to our lives, even at that point, even though that was the big thing, it was ground zero, the bomb had gone off. Excuse me, but just having a willingness to be patient with the Lord's working through this process and one another in that, I think we learned a massive lesson on waiting on the Lord throughout all this. Yes, we learned a lot about forgiveness and about love and about communication, but I think we also learned a massive lesson on just God will do what is best for his people in his timing, and it's never too soon and it's never too late. You can't hurry it, and sometimes you do. I mean, scriptures talk about it repeatedly, right? Just waiting on the Lord. Sometimes it's a lot longer than you want to wait, but it's always what's best. And I think trusting in that and just going, at the right time, Lord, you will provide what is needed. We will just keep coming to you, and we'll do that together. And we'll try to follow this path that you've set before us and the counsel that is the scriptural before us. And just like coming in the light with our sin, both going, we trust that you are faithful to your word. And that is you, and your word is what's going to carry us here. It's not going to be us doing everything right, because we didn't, it's not like, hey, we suddenly everything in our marriage became perfect. And even today is perfect, but it is very different than it was, all those years ago.
Yeah. We like to say that we didn't do things perfectly, but we did it with the one who was perfect. And that has made all the difference. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We hope you have been encouraged by Brenna and Garrett's story so far. At this point, we want to share a free resource with you. Are you worried that your relationship might not be affair-proof? Take our free 10-minute quiz to find out. Discover your strengths and potential areas of vulnerability with our comprehensive assessment. Our quiz is backed by scientific research and designed by relationship experts to help you better understand the dynamics of your relationship. With honest and accurate results, you will gain the confidence to build a stronger, more resilient bond with your partner. Don't wait till it's too late. Become empowered to take control of your relationship today. The link is in the show notes. And now back to Brenna and Garrett. Absolutely. So there's like two different levels here. There was a time when both of your relationships were at risk of an affair. And then there was the time where you were really in the trenches and fighting for your marriage. So what would you tell someone? What would you tell our listeners who maybe have a relationship that's at risk? Maybe they're drifting. What advice would you give them?
I think the very first thing that comes to mind is flee. It is just flat out flee. Those things that are so, that seem like small compromises are not small. There's, when it comes to sin and the eventualities and the consequences of it, there's nothing small in that realm. And so to compromise in one place is really to say, I'm going to continue to compromise.
Yeah.
And so to make the decision today with the Lord's help to end vulnerability, I think to the point where it's even confessing to one another, like, hey, I had these thoughts. I'm struggling with fantasizing about this. Like, had we been able to have that? Because at one point in our marriage, before we moved to Missouri, there was a point where I clearly remember Brenna even telling me, hey, I had this dream about this guy I work with. And she just brought it in light. Hey, I don't want anything. She's like, I'm not necessarily wanting anything from this person or attracted to this person, but it showed up on my dream. And this is, and that was good for us. But what happened is we didn't continue that, and so somebody finds themselves in risk. I think some of the big thing is lean in to what is right and what is true. Run to him and flee from the other thing. It's not just fleeing in any random direction. It's fleeing toward Jesus, away from those compromises. And I think the other thing is get community, even if it is awkward and weird, even if you have to go, I don't really click with these people, find godly people and just go, look, this is our lives. We need help. And will you help us? The worst thing that happens is they say no, and you go find somebody else,
Yeah,
but it is worth risking being in community as a couple, as well as being vulnerable with one another. I think those things are huge.
And we know that's hard, because I think, unfortunately, so often, I think as Christians, we can just put on the pretty mask of how life is and how our marriage is. And so when you find yourselves struggling or things are difficult, you can feel so alone at times. You kind of feel like you're the only one, because no one else is talking about their stuff. I mean, we're kind of walking through with a couple who had some infidelity, and one of his thoughts was, I'm looking around this whole church and I'm the only one. I'm the only one that has done this. I don't know who to talk to. And I just said to him, I'm like, I guarantee you're not the only one. You just don't know, because
and Satan would like nothing more than for any of us to believe that we're the only one. Right. And that's because it keeps it in, keeps that sin in the darkness, right? It doesn't bring it out into the light. I know Doug and I just recently had a sit down conversation about covenant relationships and, that being committed to that connection. And the conversation led into the jealousy that the Lord has for our relationship with him. Yes. And although sometimes we have a misunderstanding of that word jealousy, but kind of what I hear you describing is that that's what's come out of it, is that now you have a godly jealousy for anything that would undermine the connection between you two. And that's good. That's a redemption that has come out of all of the struggle that you've gone through.
Right. And for those of you who are listening right now, we want to make sure you understand that the beauty of God's, in English we call it a godly jealousy for us. It's a passionate zeal where he says, you're mine and I love you and I won't let anything come between that. Not an envy. I want to make sure that you understand it's not an envy thing. It's I am passionate for you. You are mine and I won't let anything come between us. And so, the advice that you gave, I love, because we know that, yes, we're made in the image of God, but we're also fallen. And so, we know that there's struggles that we're going to have. We still live in this body of flesh. But God's promise that we will never face a temptation where he doesn't give us a way of escape.
Yeah.
And so looking for, when you gave that advice, flee, and both of you mentioned, I didn't run from it. I stayed. We see example after example where that's true. And I know that there's somebody right now who's hearing this, who's saying that's where I'm struggling. I know where my temptation is, and I'm not turning to flee, I'm staying. And this isn't something that's new to you or we look at King David, a man after God's own heart, and he got in trouble during the whole relationship with Bathsheba because it was the time of year where kings go to war, and he stayed home. He didn't go do what he should have done, and he stayed. And I think that when we're tempted and we stay there, because it's not that bad and I won't really go that far. And I think all of us can convince ourselves that that's true. Such good advice to say, when you realize you're tempted, escape. God will give you an escape. Run from it, flee from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
No,
I was going to say, and I think, and to be sober minded, I think, part of my issue was I did think that I was above or not capable of doing certain things. And I think we all can feel that way, on some level with certain sin. And, and God's very clear, it's very clear in the New Testament to be sober minded, and that pride does come before the fall. And I think when you feel like in your own strength that you wouldn't do X, Y, Z, I think it almost just makes you even more vulnerable, because you think that you're okay in taking those little steps towards temptation, and that you won't go that far. And so again, yes, like flee, realize you're not above doing some of the things that you don't think that you will do, but that God is there to be your help and to strengthen you in those things. And so
And I think there's kind of at least two sides to that, right? There's the practical of literally, like, physically get away from it. In my case, close the computer and never look at that again would have been the answer. Hey, yeah, it was an accident. Okay, run for your life, because that's really what's at stake. Your marriage, your life is at stake. Your life in Jesus is at stake here. So there's that piece, and the other side of that, and they're not distinct. I mean, they're distinct, but they're conjoined in a way, right? Is the fleeing, the way out is always, it's the gospel. It's not just the practical, it's not just the physical, I close the computer, I stop talking to that person, whatever, but it's also moving toward Jesus, I believe, satisfaction that I'm looking for, the things that I'm aching for and longing for that aren't right here. The only solution to those things is found in you, and a willingness to say, you're going to have to teach me, Jesus, to wait on you for that. Because so often, I think, and especially in our culture as Americans, we are an instant gratification. And so the delay of gratification, which is very valued in the scriptures, awaiting, because ultimately you will find the gratification you long for, right? According to Jesus, is just such a foreign value to us as a people in this country. It is. What do you mean I gotta wait like an hour? What are you talking about? Like, when it gets to be a day, or I was talking with a friend this morning. I mean, there are things that he's waiting for on the Lord right now, and it's painful. It's painful. And there is a question for him: is Jesus going to just keep doing this to me? Like, is there waiting with no resolution? But the promise of Scripture is the resolution was taken care of 2,000 years ago on the cross, and we will still see a taste of it, a foretaste now, but the culmination of it in the day to come, right? And a willingness to bank on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A willingness to bank on that. That's a good description of faith. Have faith. The willingness to bank on it.
Yeah, to live like it's actually true, right? Like risk everything in light of the belief that I will not look back and go, I wish I wouldn't have done this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Okay. So you talked about ground zero and then the aftermath of ground zero. What would you tell the listener who is at that point or in the aftermath of ground zero?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's many things.
Yeah.
One, that who God says he is true. Even regardless of all the beliefs that are the lies that we started to believe, that he won't forgive me, he won't take me back, that there is no hope. Those are just so not true. What I experienced with the Lord was just such amazing grace and mercy and forgiveness, just a full acceptance of who I am and teaching me who I am in him, delighting in me. Like I felt all of those things. So again, just holding on to that truth of God is who he says he is, that there is hope, that even if it feels like there is no hope, there is hope. God is the God of hope. He will give you hope when you have no hope in yourselves. He will give you his hope. I would say, I think one of the things that was so good for us is that despite the sin that we both engaged in, we were both able to really see and view and each other as God's children and who he says we are. Like he did not ever once call me names or, call me an adulteress. So like he never equated my identity, even as his wife, with my sin. He equated me and treated me as a daughter of the King, who is redeemed and sanctified and forgiven and full of, and just covered with grace. And so I think just even being able to see that we are both fallen people in desperate need of a savior was really helpful to us in that. I think get help, as we mentioned earlier, have a community around you, and it may take some time to find people. Counseling, I think, was so huge for us. It's a long road. It's taking each minute, literally minute by minute, day by day, to choose to fight for one another, to choose to be in the light, to be transparent and honest, to work towards forgiveness, to commit to that, to commit to being fully known so that you can be fully loved. So I know those are just kind of some of the things I'm rattling off the top of my head. Oh, and trust was broken. Like, so we were both absolutely willing to do whatever we needed to do to rebuild that trust. And that took some time, and it was a lot of baby steps. And I think some people can feel like, why am I having to call him every time I go somewhere? Or, for him, I mean, for a long time, he drove me to work and would pick me up. Like I didn't have a car. I couldn't, and those were all okay with me, because that's just what he needed at that time. And what I was willing to give to say, I am here and I will do whatever it takes to rebuild trust. And so that might come a little bit later, not quite ground zero, because that's just still kind of the big explosion. But thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything you shared. Sure. I think some really helpful advice to us was, when ground zero happens, you are in survival mode. And so making massive decisions or trying to figure out what life looks like 10 years from now is probably not the time for that, and so that was really helpful to us, because like one of the things when we sat with our counselor, one of the first things she said to us was, are you guys separating? Are you going to stay in the same house? Are you going to live somewhere else? And we said, we weren't planning on it. And because that would have been one of those really huge and understandable, on some level, understandable that that's a decision that people would make quickly. But she really encouraged us and said, that's good. She said, that's a big decision, taking the time to figure out. And really her counsel to us was, statistically, this is what she shared with us. I remember very clearly. She's like, statistically, the couples who separate, the rate of divorce amongst those couples is exponentially higher than those who don't separate right away and try to figure it out, so I think the big advice behind that was, again, it's ground zero. When you're in fight or flight mode, it's survival. You don't have at your disposal all the facilities you normally would to make a well-reasoned, faithful decision. So give yourself the grace and the time and the space and get the help you need to do those things.
And I think practically, like just another practical thing is like I quit my job the next day. Like I was not in contact with this person anymore. Complete cut off. Anything that he may have given me, because there were gifts in the house, that he had given me, were out the door. Like we just completely purged our lives of anything associated with that sin and with that life. And so like that's just a huge step too, that not some people, are afraid to take, especially if it involves their job or something like that. But I believe that is so important. And it's part of that fleeing. Like, I'm not going to have anything to do.
Not just fleeing, but
Yeah.
an outward expression of commitment to the relationship.
Yes.
That said, like, to me, as you were describing that said more about the commitment that you had to staying in the relationship than it actually did the fleeing from the previous relationship, and that probably, those baby steps that you described probably went a long way to, solidifying that commitment, that while you didn't know what that commitment was going to actually look like in the relationship or in the physical realm, but it said, I'm committed to doing whatever it takes,
and gave value to your relationship.
Yeah. I think one of the things that was huge from the get-go for us was my every sense in Brenna coming forward was she's committed to try to make this right, to try to have God do what only he can do, to repent, to reconcile, be restored, which I know is not always the case in every situation, but I think by God's grace, the position he had us both is we wanted what we had originally come in to do. Yeah. We did not want that anymore. We had not, I had never, by God's grace again, I had never entertained, even as we began to walk through that, I did not entertain thoughts of divorce. It was, for me, it was like, and the only way that was going to happen is if Brenna divorced me. It was like, I believe the most beautiful example of the gospel is to trust the Lord for reconciliation, redemption, and the restoration of trust and relationship here. And so the way that I practically walk that out is I do the work together with Jesus of forgiveness. I do the work of humbling myself and saying, this isn't all one person's fault. Even if you take the pornography out of it, like I'm broken, I'm fallen, I bring garbage to the table. Doesn't excuse anything. I can't use someone else's sin to say this is why I did, what I did. But at the same time, also being like I gave Brenna, full access to all my devices. At that point, it was early 2000s or whatever there, so it was not as much the smartphones and stuff as prevalent as they're now. So it meant like, hey, when she goes, because I'm a night person, she's not, and so she goes to bed, the computer was off. There's no computer after Brenna goes to bed. Here I put on my computer, the software that monitors and tells her everything that I look at on the internet, so that I'm in the light. You can see every single thing, and so to your point, just saying, I'm going to take whatever steps it takes to show that I'm committed to doing what is right and what is good for the sake of my wife, for the sake of the name of Jesus. Like, a big part of it for me was the realization, and I probably preached this who knows how many times before that, but of like living out, this marriage is not about me. It's not about me being happy. It's not about whether or not it's fulfilling me, or if my passion for my wife is as great as it was as the day that I'm human. My affections are going to wax and wane, but it is about living out the promises of Jesus with one another, letting the gospel infiltrate and be present in every aspect of our marriage, and knowing that in that Jesus will fulfill everything that he says that he will.
Well, it's like, I know that you guys have shared about, the covenant marriage versus kind of the contract, and like, well, as long as these things go this way, then I'm in, but it's more of that covenant idea. So,
And part of the question was, did we mean it when we made those promises? Because now we're not in for better right now. We're in for worse. What are you going to do? That was really a big question before us. And it was like, I think we both said, well, we said we would. And so we're going to, by God's grace, we're going to, and it's solely by God's grace. Even the desire to want to do that is by God's grace, because there's nothing in us inherently that would have us do that. Inherently, we would go, I'm out. This is my out. I don't have to deal with this anymore. I go find somebody else, or I don't have to deal with,
Well, that's what culture says too. Like,
you're like, you're entitled.
Take them to the curb.
You're entitled to different or better or whatever. Whatever. And so that's you guys have an incredible story and a beautiful love story. And I know that the times that it wasn't beautiful when you were in the trenches, like I can see that, but I as I see it playing out and just listening to you guys talk about your testimony, it is a beautiful, beautiful love story, and not necessarily, although it is encompassing the love that you have for each other, but it is truly an example of Christ's love for us, and how it plays out in a marriage relationship. And I think that it is just absolutely beautiful. And so, Brenna, you have written a book, yes, called From Lover to Beloved: Rescue, Redemption, and Reconciliation to God After Committing Adultery. And I just bet that that is one of the ways that God has used the struggles that you guys have went through and redeemed that time. So tell us where we can find that book, and more about like where your website is, and just tell us a little bit more about where we can find you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I did write From Lover to Beloved. And it's really a book written to especially Christians, or maybe just those like kind of thinking about God and where he's at in all of this, who have committed adultery. There's a lot of resources out there, I believe, for those who have been betrayed, and rightfully so, because it's so devastating. Quite a few resources, even for the couple as they're walking through this, infidelity, but not a lot for the person that actually betrayed, and they are in desperate need of God, of healing, of hope as well. I think there's a lot of personal healing that needs to happen even for the marriage to move forward and heal. So that book is written from that perspective. It's very much my personal journey after confessing with God, and just all the ways that he showed up and all the truth that he shared with me, and where the hope is in after committing adultery, that it is in the Lord. So it's on Amazon, From Lover to Beloved. I think it's the only book out there with my title, with me. And then I have a website as well that is fromlovertobeloved.com that shares a little bit more about our story, has some free resources out there as well. And a link to the book too, if that's all.
Yes, and I will have all those links in the show notes to the episode too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So we pray it blesses, people walking through this, and provide some hope and some healing as well. Yeah.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being willing to come on to our podcast and share your story. It has been an amazing blessing to get to meet you and get to hear your story.
Thanks for letting us share. We appreciate it.
It's been an absolute blessing to meet y'all and have the opportunity and the privilege. Thank you. Thank you.
And for all of you at home who have been listening to the episode today, for those of you who are struggling with some of those temptations, whether it's a fantasy life or it's gone beyond that, we pray that you will be able to find the ability to escape that God provides, that you'll be able to recognize that humbly setting boundaries and seeking the Lord, there's hope in the Lord. There's forgiveness for the things that have happened. There is an escape from the temptation. There's an opportunity to rebuild the things that have been broken, and an opportunity God wants to redeem the things that are surrendered to him. And so we want to thank you for listening to this episode. Pray that you were encouraged and blessed. And we all are praying that God will solidify your marriage.